So now I'm in business, yes? Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful.
Only note is just make sure that you don't turn around and talk directly at the speaker. Or
I'll
get
get
feedback.
the feedback.
Your body will dampen it for the most part.
Okay.
But here is this. Should be good to go.
Catholic high school up in Mentor, and then also at St. Mary's Seminary, Catholic seminary up at in
It's Wycliffe, yeah.
Wycliffe, yeah. So I'll turn things over to you, Kevin, and thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thanks very much. Oh, yeah. Well, let's do this first. I've got a handout for you for reference.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Of course.
Oh, you know, I can't see it.
Oh, no. Oh, the font is.
I have more handouts. We can do this for you.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's fine. This is the only.
Teacher doesn't have to.
Well, this is the only one for today. I'm sorry, I didn't think about this. Yeah. Well, I'm. Okay, so here's how today will go. I've given you a handout on reflection. I probably should have increased the font size. The handout is really secondary. That is more for your reference later if you should come to the confessions. Of course, that's the great hope, is that by virtue of this 3-week series, if you've read the confessions before, it may inspire you to pick it back up. And if you've never read the confessions, it may inspire you to do so for the first time. So what I've put in front of you, and I would actually be happy to, it would take nothing to go in and improve the font and then send that back over if anyone wants a copy. I'm very happy to do that. That's a very simple thing. But the point is this. Today what we want to do, following on the heels of last week, is get into what Augustine actually says in the Confessions. And so you might remember from last week that we talked about the great genius of Augustine and his reception by centuries and centuries of people who have been impressed by the things that he has said in theology and in philosophy and in psychology and in politics and in language. Okay, so we have some sense of the scale, the giant that is Augustine, who kind of towers over the Western tradition. In fact, one scholar made the comment, he said, if we could have everything that all of the rest of the church fathers wrote up until the 4th century, if we could have that entire body of work, or we could have everything that Augustine wrote, we would rather have everything that Augustine wrote. This is the scale of how people understand him and his significance, because he assimilates everything that comes before him, and then he passes this on in a way that was authoritative for the Middle Ages, and we feel the effects of this very keenly today. So that's Augustine, the genius. Again, our purpose today is just to work through the biographical first 9 books of the Confessions. The Confessions is a very dense spiritual work where there's an enormous amount of artistry, there's an enormous amount of drama, and there's so much going on in each book. There's so much of Augustine's reflections and spirituality that it can be hard to even grasp what's the basic flow, what's happening in these first 9 books, what's the story that Augustine is telling us. And so the purpose for this morning is to just sketch the story. What is the story that Augustine tells us in books 1 through 9? Does this have like a pointer on it by chance? I don't want to push a button. Oh, wait. Oh, we're in business. Okay, that will be very useful. Thank you. Okay, this is a rather famous painting of Augustine. Let me say 2 things. I overheard someone talking about the pronunciation of Augustine's name as I was getting things together. And I addressed this in the first video that I did for the lay Augustinians, which, interestingly, Augustine's name in Latin is Aurelius Augustinus. So this doesn't necessarily answer the question for us, the right pronunciation. If we're talking about the city in Florida, a rather beautiful city, we usually mean St. Augustine. This is usually the conventional pronunciation. If we're talking about the man, it's usually Augustine. Augustine, Augustine, I won't correct you if you say it one or the other. No one really feels that strongly, but you'll normally find it encountered that way. But I will say something else about his name. Aurelius, a Roman person, had 2 or 3 names. You might remember this from history, or history class, or Western Civ class. Aurelius, Augustine's first name is very common in the Roman world. The name Augustinus is almost unheard of. It's a made-up name that Monica made up for him. You have any idea what it means? It's very clever. It's a diminutive, meaning a little version of something. He is Augustinus, Monica said. He's the little Augustus. He's the little emperor. That's what she named him. You look far and wide in the late Roman Empire to find anybody named Augustinus. It's kind of a one-of-a-kind name. Did she know something? This one-of-a-kind name for this one-of-a-kind child who would become a one-of-a-kind human being? It's all really interesting. Names matter, I suppose. Anyway, this is a painting.
Excuse me.
Yes?
Could you just comment on this image of him and the previous one on your
Yes.
page? Because they look like 2 different people.
Yes, thank you.
I actually Googled this morning to check on this pronunciation.
Okay.
And there were, Wikipedia or something put all these different pictures up.
Yes.
Which are paintings that look sort of like this, more than your opening picture.
Amazing. This is exactly where I plan to go.
Oh,
So we must be
there he is on the
connected at a higher level, because this was the next thing coming out of my mouth, literally. Okay, so this book I published on St. Augustine's Confessions. That's not the important thing for our purposes today. The important thing is the cover art. I found an artist, a woman in Michigan, who does modern portraiture of saints. This is her Oh, this is my book, yeah, but this is her art. This is the portrait of Augustine. I found this massively affective when I encountered it, because that's what I picture. And I think this has an enormous amount of realism to it, because Augustine is a North African, not a sub-Saharan African. I mean, don't think South Africa or Cameroon, but he's a North African. He's from Algeria. He's a Berber. I mean, we know what race he came from. He's a Roman citizen, but he's from Berber stock. So he is a North African person. Remember, the Roman Empire filled the whole Mediterranean basin. So you've got people of greatly diverse ethnic groups who are part of the empire who don't necessarily look like us and certainly don't look like that. This is what he looked like. His normal dress as a priest, as a bishop, he probably would have looked like a Franciscan. Probably would have worn kind of a brown habit and a belt, and this is what you would see. So when we come to the art, medieval or later representations of Augustine, this is obviously, or should be obvious, so this is highly symbolical. Augustine never would have worn this getup. Like, never in his life would anyone have ever seen him wearing this sort of thing, because of course this is a medieval symbol that is supposed to give us some sense of the genius and the richness of the man. I mean, it's a very, very good picture. It's a very beautiful piece of art. But I will say something about what's going on in it. I'm going to come back to this image next week because it's very important for book 13. But it's quite a good piece of art. Unfortunately, I can't enlarge the image, but you may or may not be able to see. But up in the top, there's a Latin word here. It's veritas. This is, of course, the Latin word for truth. And so truth is illuminating Augustine, right? The art is, follow the lines of the art. The artist knows what he's doing, and artists don't always know what they're doing. This guy did. Veritas, truth. The light is illuminating him. You literally see it. This book, I'll give you one guess what it is. It's the obvious answer. It's the Bible, yes. Now, of course, it's the Latin Bible, because that's the only Bible that Augustine knew or had any interest in, necessarily because he's a Latin speaker. Quick anecdote, I had a conversation with a Jehovah's Witness once. Have you done this? Be careful. I had a conversation with a Jehovah's Witness. And he said, he said that among the many things that he said as we were talking, he said, the worst thing that ever happened, the worst thing that the Catholic Church ever did. Well, okay, I wasn't Catholic at the time, so I was well amused. So, tell me, what was the worst thing the Catholic Church ever did? He said, well, they put the Bible in Latin so that nobody could read it. I said, Dan, I'm friendly with the guy. And I'm like, Dan, that they put it in Latin because they all spoke Latin. You didn't know this. He said, so anyway, Augustine has a Latin Bible because he's a Latin speaker in the Roman Empire. Okay, fine. He's reading the Bible. Truth is illuminating his mind. But look what's happening here. What's he holding in his hand? Yes, his heart on fire. This is the image of the Confessions. This literally comes... Yes. Yes. So my contemporary artist from Michigan has captured this idea. It's the heart on fire. He's holding it. So she does speaking of good art, she does a very good job. But the symbolism here is important. Augustine, truth is illuminating his mind, which is inflaming his heart, and the mind and the heart are connected by the flame. It's very good art. There's actually a lot more going on because Augustine is in the middle of writing something. I'll give you the spoiler. He's not writing the Confessions here. Because we'll look at this. I want to save something for next week. But we have to look carefully. Something is happening here. People in late antiquity did not step on books. They're extremely expensive. This is not where you put a book. I'm gonna tease you this because we'll come back to this next time and I'll explain what's going on. What book is he stepping on and why? So we'll see this. Okay, book 1. I'm gonna work through the 9 books. I'm just gonna kind of riff over the main ideas of each book. When I come to a book, if you want to attempt to read the micro font that I gave you on the page, that it'll give you the gist of it. I'm not going to follow, I'm not going to recite what's on there. I'm going to give you a sense of what's happening in each book. So we talked about this last time, the joke that I get a lot of traction out of, and everybody laughs because it's true, which is if you go to church long enough, you're going to hear a sermon, and someone from the pulpit is going to say, as Augustine said, we have restless hearts. You have made us for ourselves, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And that's an amazing thing that should be quoted in homilies and sermons all the time. I'm certainly not critical of this. And Augustine is setting, as I said last week, the keynote of the Confessions. This is in the first 100 words of the Confessions. Our heart is restless until it rests in you. So partly it gets into sermons because you only have to read page 1 of the Confessions to get the most quotable quote. And the other reason is because it actually is the keynote of the entire work. You've made us for yourself. Our heart is restless until it rests in you. And the entirety of the Confessions is Augustine telling the story of how he is going to journey to get to this place of rest. The restless heart seeking rest. This is his image for the Christian life, for the Christian journey. Augustine is a very clever writer on a number of levels. And at one level, and I'll read some of these things from the screen if the font is a bit small, but Augustine uses certain framing devices to tell his story in the Confessions, and it's not a bad idea to understand these going in. Because if we come to it and we read it and we already know this, it makes reading the Confessions quite a bit easier. Augustine organizes the telling of the story of the Confessions around the stages of his own education. And this should immediately tell us something about the man. But really, if any of us were writing a biography or autobiography, we would inevitably do this, right? We would talk about our home and our family. We would talk about where we went to school. We would talk about our experiences in college. And so this is maybe in that sense not entirely remarkable, but Augustine is the first person to do it. He writes the story of his life and he organizes it very explicitly around the stages of his education. So I'll say a word on this. I don't necessarily want to make this a Roman history lesson, but this is not inconsequential. So when Augustine was a little boy in his hometown of Tagaste, his town would have had an elementary school teacher. This person in Latin is called the literator or the primer magister. Primer magister means your first teacher or your literature teacher. This is the teacher that teaches you how to read and to write and to do practical math. And by practical math, we mean what a young Roman would need to know in order to run a farm. This is what you learned. You're not doing pre-calculus, ever, in the Roman educational system. This doesn't exist. Augustine's going to receive this sort of education from age 7 to 12. For some children, their education could stop here. This could be it. This is where we get the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? This is the model that comes from here. They taught you to read, they taught you to write in Latin and Greek. Augustine talks about this. And they taught you a little bit of math, enough to be able to engage in basic agricultural transactions. Augustine has this education. But then he's sent about 25 miles to the south to a place called Madoros, where he goes to the grammaticus. This is the next teacher in the Roman system of education. And this person gives him a thorough training in literature. Because if you wanted to make it in the Roman world, you did not have to do math. What you had to do is have an extraordinary command over Latin literature. And this extraordinary command over Latin literature was to prepare you to be an incredibly articulate and powerful speaker. This is how children were trained. This is how young men were trained. The aspiration that Augustine would have in North Africa would be to get a government post in what was then the capital of the Roman Empire, which was not Rome. It was actually in Milan at this time. Rome was not the center of political activity. The center of the empire, its administrative center, is moving at the end of the Roman world. It's in Milan. He goes to the Grammaticus. He would have been introduced to Virgil's Aeneid. This is the master text of the Latin people. If you grew up in Athens and you were Greek, you read Homer. You were given the Iliad and the Odyssey. Augustine was also asked to read this, and he says he hated it. Talks about this in Book 1, being a child and hating being forced to learn another language that he did not enjoy. But Virgil's Aeneid, he's addicted to. Augustine, as a child, would have memorized most of the Aeneid. A shocking amount of memory, a shocking amount of retention. This was in his brain from the time he was a child. And he will quote a vast amount of Latin literature, but he will quote Virgil's Aeneid his entire life. Remember, I said he had 5.1 million words. One of the things that's a great fun with Augustine is to go through and find all the places that he quotes the people that he learned as a child. He quotes Virgil. You'll find that he quotes Virgil in very important ways in Confessions. So he goes to the Grammaticus. Sometimes education would stop here. But it didn't for Augustine because he was sent to the other end of North Africa, the coast of modern-day Tunisia, to Carthage, the great city of the province of Africa for the Romans. And this is where he went to rhetorical school. This is where he's being trained to be a polished professional speaker who could then possibly ascend into law or into a high administrative post in the Roman Empire. This is Augustine's education. Books 1 through 9 generally are following this.
Who determines that, how he progresses through the education?
This was a pretty settled system by the late Roman Empire. I mean, his parents would choose, if they could pay, they would keep sending him. But this is all private education. The two important things to understand about education in the Roman world are, one, there's no such thing as public education. This is not afforded. You have whatever education your parents can pay for. And his parents were just, Patricius, his father, was just high enough in the middle class to be able to afford, with the help of family friends, to send Augustine both to the Grammaticus and to the Rhetor. In fact, in Book 2, the problem is the family runs out of money. In Book 2, he says, because of financial problems at home, I had to come back from Adoros and live with my family again. While my father Patricius raised the money, took a year to raise the money so that he could send me to Carthage to finish my education. This is the only positive thing Augustine says about his father Patricius, is that he went to greater lengths than far wealthier people in their neighborhood to make sure that he had this education.
You lost me a little bit.
Okay.
You mentioned a while ago, when you were showing his picture, that he was from North Africa.
Yes.
And right now you mentioned about Africa also.
Yes.
And that you threw in Athens. What was his native tongue?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. The reference to Athens was just to make the analogy that 5 or 6 centuries earlier, if a child was growing up in Athens in the 5th century BC, they had a master text that they taught their kids, which was Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The only connection I wanted to make is that in the Roman Empire, in the 5th century AD, they would give them Virgil's Aeneid. This was, they're Latin speakers. Yes, yeah. So the short answer to the question is, at the time that Augustine lives, Latin, people are bilingual through most of the Roman Empire. They're Greek and Latin speakers. But by Augustine's time, for various reasons that aren't important here, Greek is beginning to diminish, and Latin is on the ascendancy, to where the upper class of the Roman Empire by Augustine's time is basically only speaking Latin. So he lives in a very Latin world. The bilingualism is not something that's part of his experience. Okay, so that's Augustine's education. The other framing device that Augustine uses in the Confessions is the stages of life as understood by people in the ancient world. They recognize these. One starts out as an infant. This is a Latin word, actually, enfans. It means a non-speaker. This is the literal meaning of the word infant. It means you can't talk. And so Augustine thinks about what it was like. He doesn't have any memory of this, but his nurses explain this to him, and he talks to his mom and others, and he has some sense of what it is to be an enfans, a non-speaker. But at some point, the non-speaker learns how to speak, and for Augustine, this is where personal memory begins, and this is a very interesting insight. We don't begin to remember until we've learned how to speak. And I think the modern cognitive sciences would generally align with this. I mean, this is not a crazy thing to say or imagine. And so Augustine passes then into his boyhood. You see the word pueritia. We get the word puerile from this. You know, brothers and sisters don't say these sorts of things, but you know, a very precocious little girl might say, "Well, James, you're being very puerile today." You know, we would be shocked to hear a child say this, but it's kind of the sort of thing my daughter would have said, actually. But he passes out of boyhood into young adulthood, which this is the Latin adolescentia, adolescence. We think of adolescence as kind of like the tweens passing into, but they thought of adolescence as about 16 to 30. They had a different idea. And then finally, and these blur a little bit, but you become a Juventus, you become a young man. Now you're coming of age. Now you're finding yourself. These are the stages of life that Augustine walks us through, because remember, we only get the first 33 years of his life. So we We don't literally get Augustine as the old man because he can't tell that story yet. He's 43 when he's writing the book. He can't write about being an old man. Okay, book 1 is largely about Augustine's education and his family life. When we come to book 2, per what I said earlier, Augustine had been away to this city of Madoris getting his secondary education. The family runs out of money and he comes home. Book 2 divides into 2 things. Augustine is going to come to terms with and talk about his disordered sexual awakening. This is probably the thing people tend to associate with the Confessions, but he actually spends very little time on this, and it's not even really the point of book 2. This is not his main interest, because for Augustine, the 2 things that he thinks about when he's reflecting on being a 16-year-old is disordered sexual awakening, but then this incident at the pear tree that I talked about last week. And in Augustine's mind, the incident at the pear tree is by far the more grave matter. It's very interesting, because you think, well, that doesn't, like, no one thinks that way. I mean, that's not, these don't seem commensurate, and certainly stealing pears as a boy with a group of your friends has nothing really to do with anything seriously evil, but Augustine does think it is something seriously evil. And people have misunderstood this. As I said, the Confessions has been picked up and read by everyone. I think Nietzsche picked up Confessions at one point. I mean, he was actually a classicist. He's a massively well-trained person in Greek and Latin. But he picked up the Confessions and came to this and thought it was absurd. Of course, Nietzsche thought everything about Christianity was absurd, but this didn't help the case any, because he saw this and said, this is it? You're upset about stealing pears? But this reflects a very careless reading of what's going on in book 2, because that's not the point at all. And people miss the point. It's not about stealing pears. It's this extended meditation on why do people do bad things? Why do people do evil? Nietzsche misses the point entirely, probably through a lack of sympathy, and doesn't really want to. We have to enter into sympathy with the author to really understand what they're saying. This has nothing to do with pears if pears are throwing them to pigs. The purpose of the discussion for Augustine is to think through the nature of evil choices. And he makes the rather helpful, somewhat startling comment: people never do evil to get evil things. This is a misunderstanding of evil. Everybody wants good things. And he invokes this character named Catiline, which comes from one of the books he would have read as a child. The historian Sallust wrote about Catiline. Catiline, the details in this, I'll give you the 10-second version. Catiline was a Roman conspirator. In the mind of the Roman man, he's a horrible, horrible, horrible individual. He's a usurper, he's a murderer, he's willing to do anything that he has to do to get what he wants at the expense of anyone around him. We might call this sort of person a narcissist today. Augustine is looking at Catiline and saying, and everybody knows this story because everybody that grew up the way that Augustine grew up read the same stuff. They all read Virgil, they all read Sallust, and so when Augustine says Catiline, everybody who's reading this knows exactly who he's talking about, because they've all had the same formation. They've all had the same training. They've all read the same books. So he comes to this, and he says, even Catiline, and everybody's ears perk up, even Catiline didn't do mean, nasty things because he wanted mean, nasty things. Catiline did mean, nasty things because he wanted power. Power is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. He wanted wealth, but wealth is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. He wanted good things, but he was willing to do horribly wicked things to get them. This is the point. This is what he's getting to. But what Augustine says is this encounter with evil represents for him his own experience of the fall. This is not incidental. I mentioned that the person who wrote the painting at the beginning was a great artist. Augustine is a better artist. It happens at a tree. It involves fruit. He takes the fruit and he feeds it to the pigs, which evokes the prodigal. It's all very clever. There's so much imagery that's going on with this. What Augustine is trying to say is, when I was 16, I really came to terms with my own fallenness. I really began to confront the reality of evil in myself. This is the point, a point that I don't think Nietzsche would want to come to terms with. But Augustine wanted to come to terms with it. The map here, so Spain, right, the Mediterranean basin, Spain, the northern tip of Africa, Italy, Greece, we're generally familiar here. Well, this is Augustine's world. It's not very big. So Augustine starts his life here into Gaste, a town just south of the coast. You can still see this today. I mean, you have to have armed guards with machine guns to take you in and out of the place, but they will. You can arrange this sort of tour if you want to. I've seen pictures from people doing it. I'd love to do it. I don't think I have the courage. To Gaste. This is where Augustine begins his life. Madoros, this is the little town that I told you about where he went to school. And then if you go all the way across here, this is modern-day Tunis and Tunisia. This is where Carthage was. It sits right on the coast. It's right directly in alignment with Rome. This is the world that Augustine inhabits in books 1 through 9. His childhood, his further education, we'll see in a moment. He makes his way to Rome. He makes his way to Milan, where he meets St. Ambrose, and then he basically works his way back, and he never leaves again. In the first 9 books of the Confessions, we get this journey from here, his hometown, to Carthage, to Rome, to Milan, back again, and then he will never leave Africa again after he comes back and becomes a priest and a bishop. In book 3, I'm back up for a second. Sorry. In book 3, something happens when Augustine goes away to Carthage. He's basically a college student. This would be the way to think of it today. And what happens when he goes to Carthage? 2 things. Number 1, Augustine drifts into a religious sect that is violently opposed to the Catholic Church. These were people called Manichees. And maybe if there's time for Q&A at the end, I'll give you a quick rundown on them. We could spend a whole time just trying to come to terms with who the Manichees were. This is a crude but helpful analogy. Hopefully it helps you. The Manichees, the best way, and I'm not saying this in any way to be disrespectful, but I'm just kind of trying to compare apples to apples. Manichaeism would basically be like Mormonism today. This is like the closest analogy I could get, where it's using some of the same sacred books, but it's clearly going in very, very different directions. It's not orthodox. It's created kind of its own mythology that explains the universe that Christians and Catholics don't really identify with or can't hardly make sense of. This is Manichaeism. Manichaeism is a religion that came from Persia, where it took elements of Christianity and elements from other places and fused them together, created this fantastic mythology. But the great attraction for Augustine is this, and it will make sense to you based on what I've said, is that they said, we can tell you the solution to the problem of evil. Because people ask, why in the world would Augustine be interested in Manichaeism? We can tell you the solution to the problem of evil, and you don't have to listen to the authority of your church. Well, remember what happened in book 2. What's Augustine coming to terms with? The problem of the evil inside of him. For whatever reason, and this happens, he did not get the answers he was looking for in the Catholic Church. This is very obvious. And despite all of Monica's attempts, I mean, there was some breakdown in his catechesis that when the Manichees showed up and said, we have the answer for you. Like, we can tell you the solution to the problem of evil. Augustine says, I want to know this. So he joins them. Monica's heartbroken. He joins the Manichees. This is a part of the outworking of Augustine's fall. He has now left the church. He's not interested in authoritative answers from the Bible or the church. He's interested in someone solving this problem for him that is a felt need. So this happens. The other thing that happens is he has a girlfriend. This is not at all unusual. And they have a baby together. And he never even tells us her name. There's reasons for this we'll get into next time that are actually rather sensitive and delicate. We call her Una. There's an Augustinian scholar that refers to her as Una. It means the one and only, because that's what Augustine says. She was my one and only, and I was faithful to her. And we had a child, Adeodatus, together. And what Augustine is trying to tell us in book 3 is that as a result of the fall, things are now defective. They're broken. They're missing pieces, because he's gone into a religion that is defective. It lacks truth. It substitutes error for truth. He's gone into a relationship with a woman he's massively committed to, but it's defective. Augustine says it wasn't a true marriage. This is not a true marriage. We were faithful to one another, but we were faithful to one another kind of in our lust. That was very insightful. And this is what Augustine says. Now I've gone from a fall to a defective religion and a defective marriage that has now produced a child. So this is the situation Augustine finds himself as a young man in Book 3. In Book 4, Augustine continues with this theme. This is a funeral stele, meaning it's a monument. This isn't a graveyard. This isn't a graveyard in Tagaste, what is the archaeological site of Tagaste. I have no idea who it belongs to. But something happens in Book 4 that shakes Augustine to his core, which is that he falls in love, and I mean this in a strictly Platonic way, but he falls in love with a friend. He falls in love with a young man who he had been friends with when they were littles, and they played together. And then now they are adults. And Augustine comes home, and he doesn't tell us the name of this friend, but the friend dies. Augustine says, we were like two souls in one body. He's quoting a poet, a Latin poet, when he says this sort of thing. This is his image of the sort of friendship that they had. But the friend dies, and importantly, this is what happens. Augustine is a Manichae, and Augustine is a very evangelistic, dominant personality, and he wants to draw people into his orbit. And so this friend of his comes from a Catholic family, but he's also not very well catechized. And Augustine is trying to lead him into joining the Manichaees with him. And then they're going down this road together, and then the friend gets really, really ill. And Augustine goes to see him, and he's really sick, and he's unconscious. And while he's unconscious, the Catholic family has him baptized, because he had not been baptized. In fact, baptism was not necessarily the norm in the 4th century. It becomes the norm, but it's not. Has him baptized. And Augustine's like, oh, okay. And comes back a couple days later, and the friend has revived. He's awake. And Augustine has a joke with him, and he says, you're not going to believe what they did while you were asleep. He said, they baptized you. What a hoot. Okay, let's talk about Manichaeism. And you know what the friend says to him? He says, no, you don't understand. Like, that worked. No, I am a Catholic Christian, and if you ever want to speak to me again or continue to be my friend, don't talk to me about Manichaeism. Augustine's, as the British say, Augustine is gobsmacked. He's like, that shouldn't work. So Augustine leaves. Augustine actually says, I left him to himself, and I thought, I'll wait for this to pass, and then I'll come back and I'll have my way with him, intellectually, rationally. I'll bring him. The friend dies. And Augustine spirals down. Reflecting on this as a bishop, he praises God. He says, I can't believe how well that worked out. Like, I can't believe that he was baptized and he came back into communion with Christ and the church, and he died a committed Christian. What would have happened if I had led him into this cult and he had died in complete unbelief and in hostility to the truth of the gospel? Augustine says, I'm so happy as a bishop I can look back on this scene and I don't have to live with that guilt. Crazy. This is the sort of things Augustine says in the Confessions. So Book 4, I'm stealing the title from C.S. Lewis, but this is what Book 4, it's a grief observed. And Augustine hits rock bottom. He is absolutely at the bottom, because what he realizes is at this time, he says, while I'm grieving, remember, we have disordered affections. So this is Augustine's main thing from last week. Our souls are disordered. We have disordered affections apart from the grace of God. Augustine says, even while I'm grieving in a disordered way, and I have a sinful outlook on the loss of my friend, and I am sinning while I am grieving because I'm grieving in the wrong way. And it's this vicious cycle that is just spiraling me down and down and down. So he's coming to the bottom of himself. This is the story of the first 4 books of the Confessions, Augustine's Great Descent. This is very easy to see in the design of the book. It's the Great Descent. And then he hits rock bottom. But he's hopeful at the bottom, because he says, wait, there is an individual named Faustus who is a Manichae bishop. He's like the spokesperson for Manichaeism in the Roman Empire. A very charming, very good-looking, very well-spoken, very affable individual. We have a name for these people in the 21st century. He's a salesperson. That's what he is. And Augustine says, I'm going to meet this guy. I'm going to meet Faustus because I'm at rock bottom, and Manichaeism is not fixing it. This is not fixing it for me. I'm in a cul-de-sac. I have nowhere to go. But I can't go further down, so I'm going to meet Faustus and see if he can solve my problems, because this is the guy. Everybody talks about Faustus. He's a genius. He's a genius. Augustine says, I'm going to meet Faustus. I titled Book 5 Lucky Faustus because that's what Faustus means in Latin. It means lucky or auspicious or good fortuned. Amazing what names do. Augustine meets Faustus, and he is disappointed beyond belief. He meets Faustus, and he says, well, he's good looking, he's witty, and he's affable, but he can't answer any of my questions. In fact, Augustine says in Book 5 of the Confessions, once Faustus realized how well trained I had been, like Augustine had a premium education. Once Faustus realized how well I had been trained in the classics, he asked me to teach him. This is what he reports in the Confessions. He basically says, I went to Faustus to get my questions answered about Manichaeism, and I ended up taking the guy on as a student. That's a problem. Don't meet your heroes, right? Well, this is what happens. He meets his hero. And now he's realizing, I don't think Manichaeism is going to get me where I want to go. Interestingly, remember I told you Augustine wrote about 130 books. About 10 years after Augustine writes the Confessions, Faustus shows up on the scene again. Faustus has been exiled by the Roman Empire. Manichaeism is a quasi-illegal religion. Faustus has been exiled. He's living on an island somewhere, literally. And he writes a book against a notable intellectual Catholic, but he won't name him. And Faustus writes this whole thing against this notable intellectual Catholic. What's Augustine? And Augustine gets a copy of the book, because these things circulate. Somebody sent it to him and said, hey, remember Faustus, the guy that you used to teach Virgil to? He's like, oh yeah. He's like, he wrote this against you. They give him the book. Well, then Augustine writes an answer to the book. Interestingly, the way that Augustine structured the book, he cuts and, not literally cuts and pastes, this is how we think of it in a Word document. They didn't have Word documents, they had parchment and ink pens. He cuts and pastes the entirety of Faustus' book and responds to it paragraph by paragraph. We actually have an entire work of Faustus then. So Faustus from Confessions, we have his attack on Augustine, we have the complete response that Augustine made. And Augustine's body of literature is littered with stuff like this that's just really interesting, that has some connection to the Confessions. So Augustine would write an answer to Faustus. This is not the last time they meet. Okay. By the time we get to Book 6, Augustine has made his way up to Milan, because now he has ascended, he has a high government post, and he is traveling with a really good friend of his named Alypius. This is not the friend who dies, who is unnamed. Alypius is someone who's going to figure into Augustine's story for the rest of his life. But Alypius and Augustine are very young. They're very ambitious. Alypius is kind of an accountant / attorney who has a very good government job. They get to Milan and they meet someone. And the person that they meet is Ambrose, who would later be St. Ambrose. Ambrose is everything that Augustine was aspiring to be. He came from a very affluent, very powerful Roman family. He had a very high government position in Milan, where the emperor was, and he gave this up to become the bishop of the church in Milan. Ambrose is intelligent, articulate, energetic, and powerful. He has the position to be able to confront the other powerful aristocratic people in the Roman Empire, and he does so. And Augustine observes this, and Alypius observes this. But they observe something else too, because Augustine wants to get to Ambrose and ask him questions. And so what happens is in Book 5 we have the bishop Faustus, who is the great disappointment, who is completely accessible and completely at Augustine's disposal, but worthless. Augustine then in Book 6 gets to Milan. He gets to another bishop, but this time it's a Catholic bishop. And it's Ambrose. And Ambrose is not easy to get to. And he's not that interested in Augustine. That's an interesting reversal. Augustine has to access Ambrose mostly through his preaching. So he'll go Sunday after Sunday, and slowly Ambrose's preaching, even though he can't really get to him personally the way he could get to Faustus, the preaching of Ambrose leads Augustine effectively out of Manichaeism and puts him back in a position where he is capable of seeing the truth again. All along, Alypius, his best friend, is with him. For everything that I said about Ambrose, Book 6 is actually about his best friend Alypius, because all of Book 6 tells the story of the things that happened to Alypius, the encounters with Ambrose, but Alypius's own personal stories that prepare Alypius to be a bishop someday. And we will learn this later, both in Augustine's letters and in other works, but Alypius will go home and become the bishop of Tagaste. Now that neither of them are converted at this point, but this is what it's leading to. But Book 6, Augustine dedicates to his friend Alypius in connection with Ambrose. Okay. When we get to Book 7, the parenthesis is on purpose, because that's what Book 7 is in the Confessions. Augustine says, okay, Ambrose has talked me off the ledge. I'm going to re-enter the church as a catechumen, meaning I'm going to come in at the lowest level and be a learner. But I still have problems. And the problems Augustine says he has are, one, every time I think of God, I think of something in a body. This is not most people's problem. This is Augustine's problem. He says, every time I think about God, I think about something in a body, but I know that's not true. But I can't break this out. Break out of this. And the other thing is, I'm still struggling with the problem of evil, because I keep thinking of evil as a thing. Evil is a something. And so while he is in Milan, there is a group of Catholic intellectuals, Ambrose is probably a part of this, but lay people, who are very committed to a philosopher named Plotinus. So we don't have the time or interest or energy to get into this right now. But he encounters these works by Plotinus, the Aeneids, and these begin to help him to understand how to think about God in a way that is not bodily. And it also helps him to understand that evil is not a thing, evil is the lack of a thing. And so Augustine kind of stumbles into and sets the conversation for the rest of Western civilization on what is the nature of evil. And Augustine says, okay, now I get it. Evil is not a thing. Evil is the lack of a good that's supposed to be there. Evil is a deprivation. It's not a positive thing. It's simply what's supposed to be there, but it's not. And this, you think hard about this through the week, but this definition of evil works really, really well. And so Augustine says, okay, these books of the philosophers are actually helping to set me free. And these people who were called Platonists or Neoplatonists actually had a great deal of affection for the first 5 verses of the Gospel of John, because this basically lined up with exactly what they believed. In fact, one famous Neoplatonist said to a Catholic bishop at the time, he said, I could never be a Christian because I could never believe in the incarnation. I could never believe that God would become a man. However, he said, if I were a Christian and I were in church, the first 5 verses of the Gospel of John, I would put this in gold letters in the most conspicuous place in every single church, because I think this is absolutely true. The Neoplatonists did think that there was a word that was in the beginning. And they did think that there was a word that was God. They just didn't think it could ever become a man. It's fascinating, the connection of philosophy to the theology of the time. Okay, we turn the corner towards the end here, books 8 and 9. Book 8 is about conversion stories. So Augustine has met Ambrose. He has read very, very good philosophy that has helped him to come to terms with the things that are keeping him from faith. And Book 8 is a series of stories about other people's conversions. And so Augustine hears the story of the conversion of an individual named Victorinus, who was a very famous Roman at the time. In fact, Victorinus is the person who translated the books of Plotinus into Latin that Augustine read. Augustine is reading the books this guy wrote. He hears the story of his conversion. His heart starts to catch on fire, he says. And then he has an old friend from North Africa show up. This is Alypius and Augustine at a house with a gaming table and the letters of St. Paul. They're sitting at a gaming table. An old friend shows up and says, "Hey, have you heard of this guy, Anthony in the desert?" And Augustine's like, I've never heard of him. I have no idea who you're talking about. He's like, "You have no idea who I'm talking about?" He's like, "Nope, I've never heard his name. What's the story?" So he tells him the story of St. Anthony's conversion. Anthony walks into the church at random. Here's the reading for the day. It's, "Go sell everything that you have, give it to the poor, and follow me." And Anthony walks out and does it and becomes, of course, St. Anthony of the desert. Augustine hears this story. It's 2 stories in a row of an encounter with Scripture and an instantaneous response. And then this is what happens for Augustine. This is the famous incident of Augustine under the fig tree, where he's in the garden. So the friend has left. He's heard this story. He's kind of beside himself. He goes out into the garden, throws himself under a fig tree. He's convulsing, weeping. He can't really come to terms with where he's at in life. And he hears a child's voice. And this is, of course, the other most famous line of the Confessions in Latin. He said, "I hear a child singing, 'Tolle lege, tolle lege.'" And he says, "But I was a kid. I've spoke Latin in my life. I've never heard a sing-song by a child, 'Tolle lege.' What tolle lege, tolle lege?" Tolle lege in Latin means pick it up and read it. Pick it up and read it. Pick it up and read it. And he's like, "Tolle lege, tolle lege." And he makes the connection. Oh, pick it up and read it. And so he runs back from the garden into the house, because the thing they had been talking about that started the whole conversation about it, St. Anthony, was the fact that Augustine had a copy of Paul's letters. People didn't have complete Bibles. They had parts of the Bible. He had the copy of Paul's letters on the table. Tolle lege, tolle lege. He does it. Here's the charge. Okay, runs in the house, picks up Paul's letters, runs back outside, flips open either the scroll or the codex to the first thing that he sees, and this is what he sees. He literally grabs it. We'll assume it's a codex and not a scroll. Looks like this. Paul's letters. Opens it. This is exactly what he tells us he does, what I just did there. Boom. What's he see? That's what he sees. Romans 13:14. "But put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts." Well, this is the problem. Every other aspect of Augustine's person had been confronted and dealt with. His intellectual difficulties were solved for. His ability to subject himself to Ambrose's preaching and hear the word of God. And this is the final thing, moral conversion. The necessity to come to terms with being set free from this. And at this point, Augustine experiences the fullness of conversion. At the fig tree, in the garden, the house in Milan. Just like the stories he just heard, he has an immediate response when the word of God comes to him. It's the right word at the right time. And so this is where we end. The biographical material of the Confessions ends in Book 9, and it ends with the death of Monica. I don't think that this is coincidental. I don't think that Augustine really feels like there's much else to say, because Monica is the person, for Augustine, who is the practical instrument of his salvation, along with Ambrose's preaching. But there are 2 things that happen, though, before Monica dies at the end of Book 9. Augustine does something in response to the gospel. He does as well as he can what St. Anthony did, which is he gives up his government job, he gives up his teaching post, and he goes on a retreat with his friends and family, and Monica's there. And if you visit the place where they believe this took place, Casiago Browns is what it's called today. Cassiquiacum is what it was called then. Someone has put a monument there. And the monument shows Augustine with Monica standing over him doing the teaching. That's very interesting. Because at Cassiquiacum, Augustine goes there on a spiritual retreat to try to find answers for the first time in a meaningful way with reference to this newfound faith. And it's Monica who is the guide. While he is there as well, he has a massive encounter with the book of Psalms. Remember, he memorized the Aeneid as a child. Now he starts memorizing something new. The longest work ever produced on the Psalms in the ancient world was Augustine's commentary on the Psalms. There was no complete commentary on the Psalms before him, and there's scarcely been one that's as long since. The inspiration that Augustine takes from Cassiciacum is to have a spirituality firmly rooted in the Psalms, and he will spend the rest of his life reading, praying through, commenting on, and preaching the Psalms. And that is the end of the biographical book. So I think we ran a little bit over. I'm happy to stick here for a minute or two. If anyone has any questions on this, I know that everyone needs to probably adjourn downstairs by 10:30.
Monica was just a friend, it wasn't his mom.
No, Monica's his mom. Oh yes, yeah, Monica's his mother.
And she became a saint?
Yes,
Oh, that's his mother.
that's his mother. Yes, Monica is Augustine's mother. Santa Monica, we get the city name from. Saint Monica, yes, his mother. She is there on the retreat with him.
Thank you.
Yep, good for today? Okay, wonderful.